Hello everyone! This past week, the TCU Philosophy Club had a discussion with Professor Tim Hsiao from Grantham University over natural law theory and sexual ethics. The following presentation is the Zoom discussion in its entirety, and I can speak as the TCU Philosophy Club's Vice President that this was an amazing discussion and we are extremely thankful for Dr. Hsiao's time. So let's get started. I'm Carlos Hidalgo, and this is Phenom Philosophy.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much to Professor Hsiao for joining us today. I'm going to talk about some ground rules just really quickly. So first of all, this is going to be a Q&A after Professor Hsiao speaks for a few minutes. When that rolls around, just be respectful. We're here to learn and challenge one another to see different points of view, but just be respectful about it. In the same vein as that, speak for yourself. Don't put words in other people's mouths. If you don't agree with the point of view, that's fine. You can say so and ask for clarification, but we're not here to attack anyone for any belief that they might hold. And third, again, we're going to be using the hand raise feature under participants. If you have a question, you can raise your hand, or you can send it in the chat and we'll call on people in order. So that being said, welcome to Professor Hsiao. We're so happy to have you here. Professor Hsiao is a professor at Grantham University, and he teaches about ethics and specifically Christian apologetics, different things on natural law theory, and we've invited him here to speak with us and do a little Q&A about different views of ethics, theories of ethics and philosophy. So Carlos, if you want to take over.
Yeah, so Professor Hsiao, he was sort of, this whole event was sort of a brainchild of Julia and I. We had talked about some issues on abortion, and we had both come across the same video on YouTube on Capturing Christianity, and we came across Professor Hsiao's interview with the host. And since then, I've gone and I've watched all of Professor Hsiao's videos on YouTube, as well as engaged with his professional work and his publications. So specifically today, we're going to be going over consent-based ethics, the problem with those, natural law theory, and if possible, we could also speak on homosexuality with Professor Hsiao. So Professor Hsiao, go ahead and take it away.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm going to give a quick 15 to 20-minute summary of a view that I defend in several papers. And if you're interested, the paper that I would direct you towards is titled Consenting Adults, Sex, and Natural Law Theory. And you can find a link to that and my other papers on my website. So you can go there for a more detailed treatment of what I'm about to say. I want to start by contrasting two different theories of ethics, or two different ways of approaching sexual morality. So first is the consenting adults approach. The consenting adults approach is pretty much presupposed in our contemporary culture today. It's basically that if you consent to it, or if two people consent to it, or if any number of people consent to it, then consent is what makes that activity okay. And that form of reasoning is pretty far-reaching. It justifies a whole swath of activities that traditionally would be frowned upon. Now contrast that with the natural law approach, or the traditional approach, whereby sex is viewed mainly in terms of its proper function. So sex is oriented towards procreation and unity. And morally permissible sex is understood in terms of those proper functions of sex. And so just because you can consent to something doesn't mean you should consent to something. Now I want to start by criticizing some parts of the consent-based sexual ethic, and then I want to sketch what I take to be a superior approach to sexual ethics, the natural law approach. So if you think about the consent-based approach to sexual ethics, it's pretty simple. All that it is if you consent to it, it's okay. Now there are nuances, of course. If it harms a non-consenting party, then obviously it's not okay because that party didn't consent to it. But on the consent-based approach, what is supposed to be doing the work is the fact that you consent to it. So consent has this, you might call, moral magic. Some philosophers refer to the moral magic of consent. Consent magically makes something that would otherwise be forbidden morally permissible. Now, there's a pretty simple problem with that approach. I mean, there are many problems, but here's the main problem with that approach. If you think about how consent works, if I give consent for you to do something, what am I doing? I'm giving you permission to do something that would otherwise be forbidden. That's how consent authorizes something. I give permission for you to do something that would otherwise be forbidden. But here's the issue. I can't give permission unless I already have that permission myself. My consent can't authorize something unless that something is already permissible to begin with. And so if you want to appeal to consent to justify it, to provide a moral justification for some activity, well, that justification is going to be inherently incomplete because the power of consent depends on further facts that make that activity already permissible. I can't give you permission to take my neighbor's lawnmower because I don't have the permission to begin with. I can say that I'm giving you that permission, but I can't give permission for something that I don't already have permission for. So when it comes to sex or just any kind of activity, my consent can only be passed on to somebody. I can only give permission for someone else to do something if I already have that permission to begin with. And so basing or appealing to consent as the factor that morally legitimates some activity is basically putting the cart before the horse. You have to appeal to some further facts, otherwise consent itself doesn't have any power. Consent rests on the further fact that, you know, what you're consenting to is what you justify. So the question then becomes, well, okay, what are these further facts? What makes something permissible such that I can use consent to pass on that permission to someone else? That's the real question. Consent itself doesn't provide us with an answer. So none of this is to say that consent isn't relevant at all. Consent certainly does have the power sometimes of giving permission that you have. It's just that consent alone, a consent-based ethic alone, is necessarily incomplete because you have to reference some other or some pre-existing moral theory. Now, you can give other problems with a consent-based approach, but I think that's the heart of the issue. I mean, another approach would be to give counterexamples, right? You can consent to things that are bad for you. There was a case about a decade and a half ago, I think, in Germany, a person named Armin Meiwes, who put out an ad on the German equivalent of Craigslist, I believe, for a willing participant to be killed and eaten. Now, somebody did answer his ad, and the details of the story are extremely gruesome, but you had what was essentially a consensual killing and cannibalism. And nevertheless, I think that would strike most sensible people as being clearly wrong, even though he consented to it. So just because you can consent to something doesn't mean you should consent to it. There's what's called trans-abled people. So people who want, for whatever reason, they want a perfectly healthy body part to be amputated so that they can live life as an amputee. They seem to be in a right state of mind, although you could push back, but I'll get back to that in a second. You could say that, well, you know, they're in control of themselves. They're consenting to have their body parts amputated. So, you know, it's consenting adults, right? What's wrong with that? But clearly many of us would think that, all right, there's something wrong here. There's something not right about wanting to have a perfectly healthy body part amputated. Now, one response would be, well, they wouldn't consent to it if they knew all the relevant facts. So it's not real consent. It's not ideal or informed consent. But as soon as you appeal to an idealized form of consent, if you want to say, well, had they known the facts, they would have chosen differently. But then what's doing the work there is no longer the consent, but those background facts that are dictating, that gives us a standard of what counts as good consent and bad consent. So if there is such a thing as good consent and bad consent, well, consent itself can't be the standard. It has to be some prior standard that allows us to tell the difference between good consent and bad consent. So there are a host of different problems you could pick out with this consent-based approach to sexual ethics. So the issue again is not that consent is just a failed basis for ethics. It's just that it's incomplete. As I said, you have to reference a prior moral theory, and the question then becomes, well, okay, what is that prior moral theory? If I can't give permission unless I already have permissions, the question is, okay, what makes that activity morally permissible to begin with? And in my published work, I defend natural law theory as the alternative. Now, natural law theory, when you bring up the term natural law, there's many different kinds of understandings of natural law. There's the ancient understanding of natural law. There's the modern understanding of natural law. You know, if you read John Locke, for example, Locke is considered to be a natural law theorist, but his version of natural law is very different from the version of natural law advanced by people like Aquinas, for example. So it's useful just to get some clarification on what I mean by natural law. Because when I say natural law, well, some people say, well, natural law, are you referring to, you know, what's non-artificial, or what animals do, you know, when there's no human intervention, or are you referring to divine commands? Well, when I talk about natural law theory, I understand the term natural to be what is conducive to our proper functioning. That is, natural law is understood in terms of this idea that human beings are built to function. They have a purpose. You know, the eyes are for seeing, the hearts are for pumping blood, lungs are for breathing in oxygen, right? And so natural law theory, when I use the term natural, now there are different kinds of natural law theorists, and they might be using the term natural differently. But when I articulate natural law theory, the traditional Aristotelian Thomistic version of natural law theory defines natural law, or natural, in terms of what's perfective of human beings. So we all have various functions, we're all built certain ways, and what's natural is what conduces to the proper functioning of those parts of our flourishing. So let me give a few examples. I mean, I think this idea that things have functions, or that things are built to be used in certain ways, is a pretty intuitive understanding that many of us have. You look at the natural world, right? You look at just the body parts of plants and animals, right? Things are built a certain way. Eyes are for seeing, lungs are for breathing in oxygen. And you look throughout the natural world, there's teleology there, there's purpose, there's function. And natural law theory, as a moral theory, just says that moral goodness and badness tracks teleology. So if I say something is good, you know, if I say, well, this is a good bottle of hand sanitizer. Well, in what sense is this a good bottle of hand sanitizer? Well, it's good in the sense that it does what hand sanitizer is supposed to do, which is, you know, clean your hands, kill germs, that kind of stuff. It's supposed to, it's good if it fulfills its function. A knife is good if that knife cuts well, because that's the knife's function. You know, a teacher is good if a teacher does what teachers are supposed to do, which is impart information in a way that is digestible by students. And so our ascriptions of good and bad are based on an understanding of what something is for. If I say that, well, that's a bad meal. Well, what do I mean by that's a bad meal? Well, it's not nutritious, it's not palatable, it harms my body, it doesn't conduce to what meals are supposed to do, namely, you know, advance my flourishing. And so goodness and bad, you look at cases of just, you know, whatever, right? Even artifacts, right? What is a good or bad calculator, right? A calculator is something that's supposed to give you, you put the inputs in and gives you the correct input as the output, or the correct answer as the output. Well, a good calculator is good if it does what it's supposed to do. It's bad if it doesn't give you the right output. So all of our ascriptions of goodness and badness relate to something's function. There is no such thing as goodness or badness considered in itself, right? If I said, you know, that's good, you would ask, well, okay, good in terms of what? Good for what purpose, right? Goodness is always understood relative to some kind or some essence that it's supposed to be fitting for. And so natural law takes an understanding of goodness and badness and it applies it to human beings. It applies it to rational agents. Natural law is law in the sense that as human beings, we can reason, we can deliberate, we can engage in activities that are self-perfecting. We can pursue our flourishing. And so as rational beings, we want to pursue what's good and we want to avoid what's evil. Well, what's good for us is what's befitting for our human nature. Human beings are built to function in certain ways. Certain things are good for our flourishing. Certain things are not good for our flourishing. So if I, drink the proper amount of water every day, that's good for me because it maintains my body. If all I drink is just, orange soda every meal, all day, every day, well, that's not good for me because it's not contributing to my health. And so natural law takes this really intuitive understanding of goodness. I mean, you look at medicine, for example. Medicine is all about restoring your body to the way it should be functioning. This idea of teleology is absolutely essential to medicine, because without an understanding of how we ought to be, how do you do medicine, right? How do you correct a malfunctioning body part if there's no way that your body should be functioning to begin with? And so natural law really is just, I think, the common sense ethical theory, in that it's just about living well in all parts of your life. Now, you can get down to the nitty gritty, and the work I've published on specifically focuses on sex. What is good sex in terms of natural law theory? Well, it goes back to the question of, okay, what is sex for? What is the purpose of sex? How are we supposed to use sex? And I think there are two really clear purposes of sex. If you just look at the way sexual organs are designed, the biology of sexual organs, it's pretty clear that sexual organs are for procreation. Whatever else you might say, sex is definitely for procreation. But I think in rational beings, sex also takes on a unitive dimension. In the Christian tradition, it says that sex brings a man and wife together as one flesh. And I think there's more to that than just, metaphorical or poetic language. I think that natural law theory actually gives you the resources to cash out this idea of one flesh in really robust metaphysical terms. I mean, so you think of a union, right? Sex is unitive. When you think of a union, what is a union? Take for example an airplane. An airplane's made of thousands, maybe tens of thousands of parts, all doing different things. You got the avionics, the landing gear, the flight computer, the screws, the rivets, all that kind of stuff. And yet, they're all united together as one single airplane. How is that? Well, they're all working together. All these parts are working together to fulfill a common goal that neither can fulfill on their own, namely the function of flight. That's what brings all these parts together into a single unified organism. Take a human being, a human body. We've got tons of various parts. We've got, the brain, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, the lungs, our skin, the bones. All of these are, you might say, different parts of a person, but they're all unified together in one single person, one single body, in the sense that they all work together for the common goal of self-maintenance of a human being. And so you think about the unifying purpose of sex. How does sex bring two people together to form a real union? Well, you think of just human beings, right? I can breathe on my own. I can take care of myself. We are self-sufficient with respect to all of our functions except one function. There's only one function with respect to which we are incomplete, and that is reproduction. That's the only function we can't do on our own. And so in the sexual act, when two human beings, a man and a woman, are brought together, there is a real union being formed, in that two parts are coordinating to a common goal that neither can fulfill on their own. In that sense, sex is not just procreative, but through its procreative component, sex is also unitive and completing a function that all human beings are inherently incomplete with respect to. And so a lot of people will focus just on the procreative purpose of sex, but sex also has this deep unifying purpose that is accomplished through the procreative purpose. So the purposes of sex are procreation and unity. How does that inform our view of what's morally permissible in terms of sex? Well, I build on this on one of my papers titled "The Perverted Faculty Argument." But there's a line of reasoning in natural law theory, basically saying that because goodness and badness is defined in terms of what's conducive for our flourishing, if you use a part of your body that has a specific function, you ought to use that body part or that faculty or that organ properly, the way it's supposed to be used. And so when it comes to sex, morally permissible sex, the standard for that is determined by the procreative and unitive standards of sex, the purposes of sex. And so any form of sex that's inherently non-procreative, that's not directed towards new life, is, on the natural law view, immoral. And so, of course, that would rule out many different kinds of sex that are viewed as permissible today. So, for example, homosexuality is inherently non-procreative, and so it would be ruled out on the natural law view. Contraception is another big one. Contraception is inherently non-procreative, as is bestiality, for example. And so any kind of inherently non-procreative sex is ruled out on the natural law view. Now, of course, this is where everyone gets into the, the objections. Well, what about sterile couples, for example? The infertile, right? Are they doing something wrong? Well, we can get into that in the comments, but I think for now, what's important, what we should focus on is the idea that sex is for a specific function. Now, if you engage in sexual activity for that function, if you respect the purpose of that function, but for some reason, through no fault of your own, that function is not realized, you haven't done anything wrong, so long as you are using the parts properly. If there's if something happens outside of your control, you're not morally responsible for that. But if you use your faculties in a way that's inherently not suited for a certain kind of outcome, well then yes, you are morally responsible for that because you are not even using it in a procreative way to begin with. So I'll stop right there because there's a lot more I could get into, but I want to open it up for questions. And I also want to just reiterate that I've developed this view in a number of papers. So if you're interested, I would point you towards those papers for further reading.
Thank you so much, Professor Hsiao. Carlos, do you want to get us started on questions?
Yeah. So I think here is when we'll just kind of go over some of the basic objections that people offer. So you mentioned one in your talk, Professor Hsiao, about sterile couples, and you said how they're using the parts properly, and so by no fault of their own, they're not doing anything wrong. Would it be possible that in the act of like homosexual sex, that one party is using the parts properly and one is not, without getting descriptive, that one, I don't know how to describe it, but the one that's pitching essentially is the one that's using the parts properly, deriving pleasure, going through the same motions, but perhaps the other partner that is catching is not engaging properly. I mean, what do you have to do you have any comments on that notion?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my paper, I say that you use a faculty properly, or an organ, or whatever term you want to use for it. Different philosophers use different terms, but you use a faculty properly if you bring it to bear on an end or object that's intrinsically fitting for the kind of change that the faculty seeks to produce in that object. So in the case of sex, if a male brings to bear his sexual powers on a woman who is an intrinsically fitting object for the purpose that the goal of sexual activity seeks to bring about, it is a proper use of the sexual powers. Now, obviously, just because you might bring to bear a power on some fitting end doesn't mean that the purpose will always be accomplished. What matters, I mean, you can't control the outcome. What you can control is how you use it. And if you bring to bear a power or a faculty or an organ in a way directed towards an object that is able to bring about the type of change that it seeks to impart, then that is all you need for it to be morally permissible. Now, whether or not the actual outcome happens, whether or not conception happens, that's not something under your direct control, and so you're not morally responsible for that. So one way to parse this out might be in terms of essences, right? Male and female, men and women, are inherently complementary in virtue of having a certain essence or a certain nature or in virtue of being a certain kind. So male-female sex, as you might say, procreative in kind or procreative in type. It might not be specific cases might not be procreative in effect. Uh, but as I said, you don't have control over the outcome. You only have control over how you bring to bear your sexual powers. And so long as those powers are brought to bear on a nature or essence that's intrinsically fitting, given the type of organ or body part you're using, that's all you need for it to be morally permissible.
That's a great response. And while you moved on over to talk about essences, one question that I had was about perhaps the subjectivity of assigning functions. So how are we to discern whether a function of a certain object is intrinsic upon itself, or is it something that we are just assigning to that object? Perhaps I think you used an analogy one time about a good pencil. That pencil could be a good pencil if it writes well, but perhaps it's also a good pencil if it erases well. It has multiple functions. Can it have just one? Can you speak a little bit about assigning function?
Yeah, I mean, so some things have inherent functions, like my phone, for example, has the function of making calls and doing whatever else it's supposed to do. But I could also use this as like a paperweight, right? If I have a piece of paper and I want to keep it secure, I don't want the wind to blow it away, I can set it down and it functions as a paperweight. That you could call that an extrinsic function. And I think when it comes to distinguishing intrinsic versus extrinsic functions, you just look at the way it's built. You look at the structure of it. I mean, biologists do this all the time, right? You look at the way eyes are built. You look at the way hearts are built. It seems pretty hard to deny, just looking at the way eyes are and hearts are, that they're supposed to be used in a certain way. Eyes are for seeing, hearts are for pumping blood. Likewise, you look at our sexual organs, just studying the anatomy of them makes it pretty clear that they're designed to be used, or their purpose is to be used for procreation. And so I think a lot of when it comes to distinguishing in intrinsic versus extrinsic functions, just look at the structure of it. I mean, something might also be adaptable for another purpose. I mean, so my phone is built primarily for making phone calls, but it's also adaptable for functioning as a paperweight. But its primary function, you look at what it's supposed to do, the way it's designed, it all points towards that making phone calls function, even if coincidentally it might also be used as a paperweight or as something else.
Okay, that's great. And then humans, you said, have this rational component to them, and so that makes them perhaps like moral beings. But so would a good person be one that reasons well, or would a good person be one that's good morally? I think that I got a little confused there, because if you're saying that like the essence of like a human is to reason, right? They function well in reasoning. I think it could be easy to say that a bad human is one that doesn't reason well, and I would argue that I don't reason well. So are you telling me I'm a bad human?
Yes. No, just kidding. So there are different senses of badness here. You might distinguish between the moral and non-moral senses. So so take for example, right? If I'm blind, that's bad, but I'm not. It's not bad in the sense that I'm responsible for something. It's bad in the sense that's not what my eyes are supposed to be like. So when I speak of someone who might be bad at reasoning, that they're bad in the same way that if I have a cold, I'm in a bad state. Or, if I break a leg, my leg's bad. I'm not morally responsible for that. It's just that given the way I am, I'm not functioning in an optimal way. My flourishing has been impeded. There's something going on there. Contrast that with the moral sense of bad, where, if I say that's a bad action, well, actions are things that I am directly under control. And so that kind of badness as it pertains to the will, that's the kind of badness for which moral culpability arises. And so, and I did want to also touch on the question of just rationality. So for human beings reason, Now, what does it mean to reason? Well, to reason is to identify what's true and good. And so a rational human being, if you consider yourself rational, you will want to pursue what's true and what's good. Okay, what is good? Well, what's good for me is defined by how I'm built, what conduces to my flourishing. And so what's rational for me, to act rationally as a human being would be to pursue those actions that are befitting for me as a body-soul composite.
No, that's great. And then I had just one more, and then we'll go ahead and open it up to everybody else. In your paper on consenting adult sex and natural law theory, you talk about perhaps like a baby born with one arm. You gave that as a sort of example, as like a sort of disability, right? But what immediately came to mind was, but isn't that baby just good at having one arm? And when that, that would make them like suitable for like one arm push-ups, and then that adds to like the subjectivity of like assigning function. And I was wondering, like, would that like suffice as a possible example of showing how like maybe us assigning function is something that we do onto an object rather than that object being intrinsically for that purpose?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing about the natural law account of goodness. So Peter Geach has a paper on goodness. It's titled Good and Evil, and he talks about goodness being what's called an attributive adjective. So goodness and badness is always goodness and badness under a description. Good for this, good for or bad for that purpose. So suppose so let's say that I have I'm blind in one eye. I might be a good pirate. Having a patch over my one eye, being blind, I'll be a good pirate, but that doesn't mean I'm a good human being. The question is, which description should we use? Which description of goodness should we use for evaluating moral actions? And given that we are human beings, the relevant description the relevant description of goodness we should use is goodness for human beings. So I can be a good pirate, but that's being good as a pirate. And what matters is not being good as a pirate, because I'm not essentially a pirate. I am essentially a human being. And so the relevant description for goodness we should use is what we essentially are as human beings. So, if I have one leg, I can be a good pirate, and I can have a peg leg and look like a pirate, right? I'm a good pirate, but that doesn't mean I'm a good human being. And again, what matters for the moral life is that we flourish as what we essentially are as human beings. So it's not wrong to speak of goodness under different descriptions, right? I mean, if you can come up with any number of different descriptions in which a specific feature or quality is considered good or bad. So if let's say that I dress up as a Donald Trump impersonator. Maybe I'll look horrible because I don't look anything near Donald Trump, so I'll be bad as a Donald Trump impersonator, but I'm not bad as a human being, right? Or I might be bad as a teacher, or I might be bad or good as a serial killer, but that doesn't mean I'm good as a human being. So again, the relevant description is what I essentially am, what we essentially are, human beings.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. I have one question. I wanted to bring it back to an example that you gave earlier in your talk about, say someone drank orange soda all day, every day. That's the only thing they drank. That would be contrary to nutrition. That would be contrary to essentially who they are as a human. Does that make them immoral for doing that, since it is something that they are freely choosing to do? They are responsible for that action. Is essentially my question is someone who drinks orange soda all the time have the same level of immorality as what you're saying homosexual people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So natural law theory is really just about living well in all aspects of your life. I know some moral philosophers, some moral theories draw a distinction between, just matters that are completely, permissible, that you have discretion over, and others that are really morally weighty. But in natural law theory, you don't really have that division. Everything you do that's under your rational control can be evaluated morally. Now, does that lead to a very legalistic approach when it comes to, the person who eats a Big Mac? Is he doing something wrong? Or is the person who has a large Coke, is he doing something wrong? Well, let me phrase it this way. So when it comes to our well-being as human organisms, all of our body parts, the lungs are for breathing air, hearts are for pumping blood, all of these serve one central function, namely self-maintenance. And when it comes to self-maintenance, there's a certain amount of leeway, you might say. I can have a Big Mac and get away with it in the sense that I am still self-maintaining. My core, well-being is not compromised. And so you can think of body parts as having proximate functions. So the lungs have the proximate function of breathing in air, and ultimate functions. And the ultimate function for every body part is self-maintenance. And so, maybe I can get by having a soda a day and not have that negatively impact my health. But if I start drinking to the point where that becomes unsustainable and my health starts taking a dive, then yes, I do think you become morally responsible. In fact, I would say that's basically gluttony, right? You are not taking care of your health. Now, you might make the argument, and John Corvino makes this objection against natural law theory, that he says, well, if it's okay to occasionally do unhealthy things, why can't you also apply that to sex? Why can't you occasionally do things that go against the function of sex, so long as they don't detract from your bodily well-being? There's a key distinction here, though. You look at the various parts of our stomach, our heart, our lungs. All of those have the purpose of self-maintenance. They're focused inward at maintaining homeostasis, at keeping us as functioning human beings. Sex, however, is a function that's other-directed. It's not directed within, it's directed towards the generation of new life. And so you don't get that leeway there. Either it's you don't get away with saying, well, I can occasionally have bouts of non-procreative sex, and it's okay. Whereas when it comes to self-maintenance, because there's a certain amount of tolerance we might have, you can get away with maybe having an orange soda once, every now and then, or a Big Mac, or a huge tub of cheese puffs whenever you're watching a movie. And I also will say, though, but as Aristotle said, it's virtue is a mean between vice and excess. And so that may not be the case for many people, right? So if your health is very sensitive, maybe drinking one orange soda is so detrimental to the point of being a moral wrong. And so it depends on, there is some amount of, you might say, give when it comes to it being person relative. So maybe your health is so great that you can have 2 sodas every day and it doesn't faze you. But maybe you've got some chronic, pre-existing health problem, and if you even have just a small sip of soda, it's gonna, really ruin your day. In which case, I would say that would be an unwise choice to have a small sip of soda, and you would, yes, be morally culpable for that.
Okay, and I have some questions that came from Douglas earlier, kind of going along on this track. He says, procreation is a function of the hands, lips, eyes, etc. So how can it be permissible to use them in ways that are not open to procreation? As a follow-up, what in natural law implies consent is necessary?
Wait, so procreation is a function of the hands, lips, eyes. I mean, biologically, that doesn't, I mean, maybe I'm misreading him here, but biologically, procreation is how that happens. It's through the sexual organs. Now, you can, in the sexual act, obviously your other body parts cooperate, as maybe you might say accessory organs to get the job done, in which case I would say, yeah, as long as you're working together to fulfill, your body parts are working together to fulfill a function. I guess I don't see what's wrong with that. Let me see the comments here.
Yeah, it's in the chat.
So how can it be permissible to use them in ways that are not open to procreate? I guess I'm just not entirely sure what he's asking. If he's saying that, please correct me if you're wrong here. If you're saying that, is it okay to use all these other organs to help out procreation? Well, yeah, that's fine, so long as you are, what you're doing is you're really helping out the goal of procreation being accomplished. And so I don't see why there would be a problem on natural law theory with helping out procreation, so to speak, using some other body parts. As a follow-up, what natural law implies consent is necessary? Well, as rational beings, right, we are ends in ourselves. So that's borrowing a term from Kant. But as rational beings, we are ends in ourselves. And you can't have a union. You can't have a true union without cooperation. And so what's essential to sex, sex is not just an animalistic thing on natural law theory. Because we are rational beings, consent is necessary to form that union, because you need cooperation between the two beings who are procreating. So it's a union, it's a full bodily union, a union of bodies, hearts, minds working together to form a common goal, and that goal is procreation.
Harry, you have a hand up?
Douglas's question, second question, was basically what I was asking. I was going to say, you object to consent-based ethical system because consent is not sufficient for a morally permissible action in all cases. Then my follow-up question was what Douglas asked. I was going to ask you can you elaborate or provide an example for consent's necessary role in a morally permissible action and function under natural law theory? But I think you already addressed that.
Well, yeah, don't get me wrong. I don't think you can completely dispense of consent. What I said in the beginning is that consent is by itself not sufficient. So consent is a necessary but not sufficient condition for morally permissible sex.
I think Douglas asked in the chat about if your goal is to force a person to consent, even acting with the intention of forming a unity. I guess
I'm not quite sure what it means to force them to consent. You can't force someone to freely choose or freely agree to a course of action. So and I think sex has to be consensual, because sex is a union, and you don't have a union without cooperation. And if you force it, well, that's not cooperation.
Okay, that's great. I wanted to ask a question. You had lumped like homosexuality, bestiality, and those types as being like immoral sex. What of like masturbation? So that's like a sort of like for the purpose of just like self-pleasure, and kind of just what's the role of pleasure when it comes to sex in general?
Yeah. So masturbation would be wrong on natural law theory. Now, when it comes to pleasure, so pleasure, I guess the analogy I like to use is, so if I'm eating a delicious meal, right? The meal is delicious, but the reason why I'm eating the meal, or the reason why the meal is good, isn't just because it's delicious. It's because the meal is actually good for me. It's nutritious. It's befitting for me. So you could think of pleasure as something that incentivizes sex. We engage in sex because it's pleasurable, and the pleasure, you might say, functions as a reason to engage in a sort of action that has a further purpose. So it's like, I mean, if eating weren't pleasurable, we'd probably do a lot less of it, because it's just something we'd have to do. And so I think pleasure is attached to sex because sex is this important. The generation of new life is important, and if you make something pleasurable, then there is more of an incentive. There's more of a reason to engage in those sorts of activities. But pleasure itself is not an independent purpose of sex any more than it's an independent purpose of eating, right? Just because something might taste good doesn't mean that it's okay to eat it. There might be something that tastes good. There are many things that taste good, but which are not good if we consume them. And so we have to view pleasure as subordinate to a more primary purpose or a more primary function.
That's great. And I think, I don't know, when it comes to, I like your analogy to food, and I think that's true. I think maybe where my confusion is how I sort of like think about like masturbation as not being sex. Rather, it's just a pleasurable thing that I do by myself. So like, you know, you have procreation and unitive aspect as being like good sex, but you know, what if I can define masturbation as being like I'm deriving myself sexual pleasure, but I'm not doing sex. So those conditions don't need to hold.
Yeah, I mean, technically, masturbation isn't sex. I mean, we call it a sexual act. We might classify it as a kind of sexual activity, but metaphysically speaking, it's not sex. There is no other person involved. There is no union. There is no procreation. It's just something you do that's solitary. And so now, I guess I would also extrapolate this kind of reasoning to homosexual sex. Because if you think of homosexual sex, it really just is, not to be graphic, it's just mutual masturbation. It's not actual sex. There is no real unity or procreation being formed. So if you want to, you know, be technical on the metaphysics here, genuine sex must involve a union. Otherwise, because sex, you know, intuitive understanding of sex is something that involves another person. And I've given an account of sexual activity whereby we can understand sex as something as a real deep unity, right? I mean, if I, for example, if I, you know, bump fists with you, or if I bump into you in a subway car, or if I shake your hand, I'm not really uniting with you. I'm contacting you, I'm touching you, you know, but that's not really a unity. You know, if a surgeon sticks his hand into a patient's body when he's doing surgery, he's not forming a union, right? And so sexual activity, insofar as sexual activity is unitive, has to involve this procreative unity. Otherwise, it just really isn't sex. It's not sex any more than just, you know, bumping fists together or shaking someone's hand counts as a unity.
So kind of pushing on this point, on the sort of pleasure side, say you've already eaten dinner, you already, you know, put nutrition in your body, but you eat a piece of cake purely for pleasure. You're not hungry, you just eat it for pleasure. So you may be doing a natural function of eating, but you're not directing that action toward nutrition. You're directing the action toward pleasure only. And so that means pleasure has replaced nutrition as the end. And I feel like this is something a lot of people do. Like a lot of us will snack, we'll eat just for pleasure and not for nutrition. So under this view, wouldn't eating cake like that be an immoral act?
So on the view I sketched, so pleasure works as, you might say, a kind of incentive to get you to do something. Now you might act for, you know, you might say, well, I'll eat this meal, or I'll eat this cake, or I'll engage in sex because I want to feel good, because it's pleasurable. That's fine, so long as it turns out the way it's supposed to, so long as the parts fit, or the parts go in the right place, or, you know, the end of respecting the body parts is accomplished. I don't really think it matters, you know, what you have on your mind when you eat or when you engage in sex, so long as you're doing it properly, so long as you're respecting the proper functions of those parts. Because like I said, pleasure has this goal of being an incentive. And so sometimes we will act for the sake of pleasure, even though the kind of action we're engaging in is, you might say, respectful of a body part. It just happens to be that what's on our mind right now is pleasure, because pleasure is what jumps out to us. But that's the alluring thing about pleasure, is that it gets you to do things that are good for you.
I have a worry about what you just said about it doesn't matter what you have on your mind when you're doing a thing. to me, how I'm understanding that, intentions don't matter as long as what you're doing goes toward the proper function of whatever it is. So wouldn't that have some problematic consequences in, say, like sexual crimes?
Yeah. So I guess I might have been a bit too general in my summarization of things. I do think, you know, your intention at least has to be. So let's say that, you know, I engage in sex, but the reason I engage in sex is because I really want it to be pleasurable. I just want to feel good. I want to feel the experience of engaging in sex. That's fine. But when it comes to your intention, you also, I mean, you have to be open, for example, to the possibility of new life. If you engage in sex for pleasure, but you also have this intention that, well, you know, I don't want procreation, I'm closing myself off to that, I think that does indicate something wrong. So maybe a better way of phrasing it would be openness to, you know, what that activity is for. Openness towards, you know, forming a union, openness towards procreation, openness towards nutrition. Doesn't have to be, you know, like in front of you, but as long as I think you're open towards it in a way that you're not rejecting it, then I think that would be permissible. So in the case of sexual crimes, right, when you, if you know, if you engage in rape, for example, well, I think when you engage in rape, you explicitly are, you know, have on your mind, you don't care what the other person thinks. You want to assert yourself in a way that you don't care for, you know, their autonomy, their being a rational being, and so you aren't really forming a true union in that sense because there's no cooperation there.
And then I guess, so about kind of infertile couples is an objection that comes up frequently. You say that it's, you know, if it's not the person's fault that, you know, it's that the body doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So how, I guess I'm trying to think how best to phrase this.
Well, let me just add this while you're thinking. So I do think it's if you intentionally render yourself unable to have children. So for example, if you get a, you know, a vasectomy, for example, or if you get you know, an IUD or some kind of procedure done that renders you incapable of procreating. Yes, I do think you're doing something wrong there. But you know, if you engage in sex and it just happens not to be procreative, you know, whether or not you're infertile, that's not your fault. You don't have control over that. But I do think you can do things to yourself that make you unable to have children, and such that you are culpable for that.
Okay, so while you're talking, thank you. I did figure out how I wanted to phrase. So people who are, a lot of people who are infertile, often it's just the way that they were born. But also, I mean, some people think this is controversial. You are born with your sexual orientation as well. So if you're born, if these are both born qualities that you are given at birth, then how is an infertile couple, heterosexual couple engaging in sex different from a homosexual couple engaging in sex, where it's not really either's fault that that particular sexual act can't produce children if both of those things, the infertileness and the, say, homosexuality, are both given qualities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that being born with something in itself is morally neutral. What matters is what you do. I guess what matters is, one, what you're born with, and two, how you use that characteristic or trait you're born with. So for example, you know, you can be born with traits that are good or bad relative to, you know, what a human essence should be. So if I'm born with a disposition towards alcoholism, or a disposition towards, you know, just fits of anger where I lose control, those are things that I'm born with, but they would not be good dispositions to you know, to nourish or to continually cultivate and act off of. Now, if I'm born with a disposition, say, for athletic ability, or a disposition for, or maybe a disposition, that renders me, maybe incapable of thinking at a level that many people think. Those trying to, I guess, fix or acting on those dispositions isn't necessarily wrong. So when it comes to what you're born with, we have to ask the question, okay, is that disposition you're born with, is it good or bad relative to what human beings should be doing? Now, when it comes to, say, a disposition towards engaging in sex that is non-procreative, that disrespects the function of our procreative organs, I would say akin to a disposition towards alcoholism or a disposition towards, towards having a short temper, that is not a good disposition to cultivate or to act off. Having that disposition itself is not wrong. It's what you do with that disposition. Now, when it comes to a disposition like, or a characteristic like being infertile, or being, you're born blind, or you're born with, something doesn't develop properly, it's not wrong to try to rehabilitate those disabled parts, or try to act in a way that, restores them to their proper function. Or even if, if I'm born in, in a way that, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. If I'm born with a disposition that really can't be corrected, it's not wrong to maybe say, let's say I'm born blind, right? And my eyes just can't see, they can't be fixed. It's not wrong maybe to get a glass eye or to get cosmetic surgery to make myself look better, because those dispositions are not dispositions that I should be having to begin with. So it's not wrong to improve on bad things that are inborn, but it is wrong to build on bad things, or well, I guess I'm using the terms good and bad here in different ways. It's not wrong to improve on defects or disabilities that I have. It is wrong to build on characteristics that are diametrically opposed to how I should be behaving with respect to some body function. Hopefully that was clear.
Yeah, thank you. And Douglas, I do see your question in the chat. I'll get to that in a second, but I think you also had another one you sent me that's kind of related to this. So Douglas asks, many animals use sexual play to form social bonds. With humans as the preeminent social animal, could this not be considered a part of survival? And I guess kind of adding on to that, you base the unitive part of sex on the procreative part of sex. So are we able to separate it so unitive could be that form of social bonding?
Well, you can't have a unity with, so the way I explain it is that sex is unitive in virtue of its being procreative. I mean, so what forms a unity is that you have different parts working together for a common goal or a common function. So what makes sex unitive is that in sexual activity, you have two beings working together to fulfill a common function that neither can fulfill on their own. And so there is that deep, real metaphysical unity there. And so you can't really separate the two. So when it comes to bonding, yes, sex is, if you want to use that term bonding, sure, I would phrase it in terms of uniting with another being. And so it's not completely wrong to say that sex is for bonding, but you have to understand bonding in terms of that procreative function.
Okay, and then Douglas's question in the chat was, are anorexics evil? I guess that's kind of in the opposite direction of like the person who drinks orange soda all the time.
Yeah, I think there are various degrees of culpability here. If you have a mental illness that, gives you these obsessive compulsive thoughts to do unhealthy things, I think there is room there to say that your responsibility is mitigated, or that there's a condition there that removes your voluntariness, and so that you're not as blameworthy as someone who does it, without any coercion or without any thing interfering with their thinking. I mean, the thing about anorexia is classified as a disorder, and so not just anorexia, right? Many people do stupid things because they've got mental illness, and so I think when it comes to those conditions, you have a coercive force that is mitigating the amount of blame or praise you can have. And so I do think in some cases where you harm yourself, that is morally culpable, you're doing something wrong. That's not to say, though, that your blame can't be diminished because of maybe a chemical imbalance in your brain, or coercive social pressure by people that in your friend or social group. And so I think there's room to talk about levels of blame and responsibility there.
I think I had one more
Sure.
question, and that has to do a little bit with the orange soda example, and this one actually has to do with alcohol. So I know that you've sort of spoke out before against the consumption of alcohol, and I guess I'm sort of equating, like, perhaps like I'm sure you can imagine like a cocktail that's like sugary and sweet and has like fruit and whatnot, has things that are good for nourishing, but then it might also have a shot of vodka in there, right?
Yeah.
It still has those nutritious aspects to the drink. Would that be immoral under natural law theory?
Yeah, so I don't think drinking alcohol is intrinsically wrong. I personally do not drink. I don't think, though, that alcohol consumption is always wrong. I think drunkenness is wrong. I think you can consume alcohol without having it impair your rational faculties, and if that's possible, which seems to be the case for many people, you might have many of my friends have a glass of wine, after a long week of work, just unwind. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I do think, however, that there is something wrong with drinking to the point where you lose control of yourself, to the point of intoxication. So, and this, I mean, like the orange soda example, I think a lot of when it comes to our personal health choices, just because of how we're built, there is room for moderation. There is room to have, occasionally, you can have a cheat day and have a Big Mac. That's not inherently wrong, because, your body parts are all ultimately ordered towards the goal of self-maintenance. And if self-maintenance is still going on, there is not an issue having, a gallon of ice cream or an orange soda, so long as you are the kind of person who is able to, bear that. Now, if you're prone to alcoholism and one drink is going to just set you off and make you drunk, probably you shouldn't do that. That probably wouldn't be morally permissible for you. And so, and I think this aligns neatly with our intuitions here about moderation and excess. Some people can handle more, some people can't handle as much, and it all goes back to this idea of natural law theory is really just about living well, and living well. There's going to be some amount of leeway for some people. Some people can tolerate alcohol better than others. Some people can't tolerate alcohol at all. Some people, are better at certain things and are not. And are not at other things. And so I think this aligns very nicely with our intuitions about moderation and excess.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Hsiao, or Professor Hsiao, my bad. I want to be conscious of our time. I know that you will need to leave in a couple of minutes. I wanted to ask Dr. Hester if you had any comments or questions. And Dr. Hester is into a lot of Greek philosophy, so I know the talk of teleology, Aristotle is kind of up your alley.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, I was actually typing in the chat that question. Professor Hsiao, thanks for joining today. Sorry I was late to the game. I was at a faculty senate meeting, and we went a little bit over today. I wanted to return to your comment about, so that this will lead into a question I have about the sort of metaphysical commitment that accompanies this natural law view. So it sounds to me like when you're responding to Julia's question that there's a way in which one's natural functionality on this view is really sort of established at birth. And then that guides the norms according to which one would seek flourishing in life. And that seems to move away from this other metaphysical view that I thought you were, or that the natural law view is committed to. So I was wondering, is it committed to a metaphysics of essence? And is it committed to a metaphysics of telos, of purpose?
Yeah, so on natural law theory, essentialism and teleology are indispensable. You can't have the Aristotelian Thomistic version of natural law theory without those things. Now, the modern, the Lockean conception of natural law dispenses with those conceptions. But I think when it comes to essence, I wouldn't say that it's established at birth. I would actually go before that. I would say that human beings, qua human beings, have a certain nature, and that human nature is what actually directs human development from conception onward. So the reason why we develop in the way we do, the reason why we develop eyes, ears, and all that kind of stuff is because from conception onwards, we have this organizing principle, you might say, this essence that functions as a blueprint, and that over time, over life, we unfold in our various ways into a mature form of the kind of thing that we already are. Now, that's different for some people, but there is this common underlying, you might say, principle, organizing principle, this essence or soul, you might say, that basically determines what we're supposed to, what we are for, what we're supposed to do, and how we are developed in respect to just the various contingencies of life. And so I would adopt, when it comes to essences, I would adopt a very robust essentialism that is not, when people talk about there's the essence, there's many different kinds of essence. I would just go straight back to Aristotle and Aquinas and adopt their view of essence as the view from which I'm advancing.
Oh, I see. So you're okay. That actually clarifies a little bit. So you're grounding your view on this Aristotelian Thomistic picture of things. Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah. That's a major metaphysical commitment.
It really is. Yeah. And I don't shy away from it. And for what it's worth, there's a lot of the contemporary metaphysics and philosophy of science literature. There's somewhat of a revival of essentialism going on nowadays. Nancy Cartwright, Brian Ellis, Stephen Mumford, David Oderberg have all written really extensive and robust scientific versions of essentialism. The criticism of essentialism is that, well, ever since Darwin, he dispensed with this idea that we need essences because he showed that you can have descent through modification, and that seems to call into question this idea of Platonic essences. But in fact, if you look in modern science, essences are very much alive and well, and there's a sort of neo-Aristotelian revival going on right now in metaphysics.
In metaphysics, yeah. Well, I have more questions, but I know time's short.
Yeah, so we're just about out of time. Thank you so much, Professor Hsiao, for meeting with us and talking through this ethical theory. I feel like we got a lot done today. Hopefully we're all leaving here a little more enlightened, whatever views you may hold. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and have a good rest of your evening, everybody.